Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning. This is a global event, so we don't know exactly where you are, but we're here at 1300 York Avenue at Weill Cornell Medical College, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Heberden Society lecture. It's co-sponsored by the Division of Medical Ethics. I'm Joe Finns, I'm Chief of the Division of Medical Ethics, and we have an absolutely outstanding program this afternoon. Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to give virtual thanks to Nicole Milano, who was our former head archivist here at the archives. She had to relocate to Norway for some good family reasons, and we miss her very much, but she's online with us, and she's a big part of the success of the archives for the past and going forward. This afternoon, we have an absolutely outstanding speaker, Jeremy Brown, who's a physician and an ER doc who now heads the Office of Emergency Research Care at the NIH, where I met him. He's the consummate program officer, but he's really more than that. He's a humanist and a scholar. He's one of these people who is just learned. And as I got to know him at various meetings, I learned of his love of history and this sidebar that he does, in addition to his work as an academic physician. He's a writer and a historian, and he wrote this really marvelous book called The 11th Plague, which I hope you can see, Jews and Pandemics from the Bible to COVID-19, which he just told me won the National Jewish Book Award. So we have a very distinguished guest. Jeremy is British, as you'll see. He has a much better accent than I do, and everything he says sounds very smart. This afternoon, he's going to speak to us about diversity and exclusion, the Jewish pandemic experience, which in light of all the tensions in the world is especially apt. So without further ado, let me ask Dr. Brown to come to the podium. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much. Okay, it's really a delight to be here in person, not on Zoom. What's happening? Okay. For those of you who are online, this is a magnificent room. It's got beautiful wooden paneling and pictures and an enormous boardroom table. And it has a refrigerator in it that said the drinks in this refrigerator are only for boardroom members. So but actually I would say this is the second nicest place I've ever been able to give a lecture. The first one was the Rosenwald room in the Library of Congress, which has even more ornate paneling. But this is a very good runner-up. So thank you for allowing me to be in this beautiful room and to give a talk for the Heberden Society. I don't know which of the two William Heberdens this society is named for, the elder or the younger. I looked them up and I couldn't find. No, we don't know. Well, that'll have to remain a mystery. But it's really a privilege to be here and to speak. And thank you, Joe, for your friendship and for inviting me. So today I'm going to speak about diversity and exclusion, the Jewish pandemic experience, and much of the information that I'm going to be sharing with you comes from the research that I did for my book, The 11th Plague. In 1884, Britain's leading medical journal, The Lancet, voiced concern over the ever-increasing number of Jewish refugees that had emigrated from Eastern Europe. You can read the text along with me. This is from The Lancet. The foreign Jews, who for many years have been flocking to the East End of London, it stated, are so numerous that their presence seriously affects the social and sanitary condition of this part of the metropolis. All things considered, it will be seen that the presence in our midst of this numerous colony of foreign Jews gives rise to a sanitary problem of a most complicated nature. It is unfortunately not merely the foreign workman, but the dirty habits foreign to our ideas of salubrity being introduced in our midst. Jews were not only taking jobs from the British, they were a health risk. Across the Atlantic, here in the US, where over 2 million Jews had emigrated from Eastern Europe between 1880 and about 1920, there were identical concerns. Writing in the Military Surgeon in 1908, a medical director of the United States Navy by the name of Manly Simons noted that not only are the Jews very tuberculous, but that the poorer classes of Jews are very unsanitary. They work and live in dirty and badly ventilated quarters. Once again, Jews would be blamed as the cause of pandemics, but this time it was not because they were poisoning the water, which, if you remember, had been the accusation during the Black Death of 1346, in which Jews were attacked in more than 300 communities and their wealth plundered and many thousands burned to death. No, this time it was because the Jews were filthy. But there was more. While upper-class Jews were healthier and wealthier, Manly Simons wrote that, as a type, Jews are beginning to show mental and physical degradation, as evidenced by the great variability of development, great brilliancy, idiocy, moral perversity, epilepsy, physical deformity, anarchistic, and lawless tendencies. This anti-Jewish sentiment was only one example of the general fear of the outsider, who was often blamed for importing disease. And this has long been a part of American history. For example, in Philadelphia, yellow fever, which was a disease that was transmitted by mosquitoes, was once called the Barbados distemper, because it was believed to have been imported by immigrants from Barbados. Then in the 1790s, the same disease became known as Palatine fever, after the Palatinate region of Germany, from where many immigrants with the disease had arrived. And when 2,000 immigrants who were Black refugees from the slave revolution in Haiti arrived in Philadelphia, the same disease was now blamed on the Haitians. In fact, all along, it was the mosquitoes in Philadelphia who were transmitting the disease. And a century later, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 prevented the immigration of Chinese laborers and, quote, the introduction of their diseases, crime, pauperism, and servile labor into the United States. The fear that immigrants would be a burden on society into which they assimilated was not new. And of course, it affected all outsiders, not just Jews. Going back to 1700, the Massachusetts colony passed a law that prohibited the entry of, quote, lame, impotent, or infirm persons incapable of maintaining themselves, unless they could give assurance that their care would not become a public burden. Immigrants were often identified as the cause of several specific epidemic diseases. And this afternoon, I'm going to focus on just 3 of them as they pertain to the Jewish community and immigrants into the city of New York. Those are tuberculosis, typhus, and cholera. So we'll begin with tuberculosis. Although today in the United States, there are relatively few deaths from tuberculosis, there are still about 7,000 new cases each year. But during the latter half of the 19th and the opening years of the 20th century, there were terrible epidemics of tuberculosis in the United States, as well as in Great Britain and Europe. Now, these epidemics became associated with the mass migration of Jews from Eastern Europe, and tuberculosis became known as the Jewish disease or the Taylor's disease. Some Jews arrived already carrying the disease, while others caught it in the overcrowded conditions in their new homes. Now, tuberculosis was and is associated with overcrowding, and Eastern European Jews came from very crowded living conditions. In his book-length study of immigration and health, the historian Alan Kraunt noted that in Kovno, Jews constituted 70% of the total population, but only had 50% of the total houses. In Grodno, 80% of the population, and yet only 65% of the houses. And in Vilna, 60% of the population and only 40% of the houses. Moreover, many houses were in deplorable condition, with dirt floors and small windows that permitted minimal air and sunshine to enter. Despite this, however, the mortality rate of the impoverished European Jews was generally lower than that of the general population. According to Arthur Rupin, who was the director of the Berlin Bureau for Jewish Statistics, the mortality rate in 1907 from tuberculosis was about 18 per thousand for Russian Jews and over 32 per thousand for Gentiles. Rupin did not believe this was due to a difference in race, but rather to an absence of drunkenness in the parents and the better nourishment and care which the poorer Jews bestow on their children. In New York City, Jewish, Russian, and Polish immigrants actually had the second lowest mortality rate among 13 ethnic groups, and native Jews ranked 6th. Here is the data taken from Arthur Guilfoyle, who published it in 1907 in a journal called The Publications of the American Statistical Association. If we look at just one example, that of typhus, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, we will note that the Irish and Italian immigrants' rates of death from typhus were 21 and 30 per 100,000 respectively, while the death rate of those from Russia and Poland, i.e. the Jews, was just 7 per 100,000. Now, regardless of the truth of this observational and statistical data, Jewish immigrants, just like their Italian counterparts, were always on the defensive when they entered the United States, where they constantly had to prove that they were neither biologically inferior nor a threat to public health. In 1902, Morris Fishberg, a physician, rose to the defense of his fellow immigrants. Philanthropists and reformers, he wrote, are apt to regard the immigrant Jewish population of New York as a slum population, as degraded residents of narrow, filthy streets whose foul general habits are beyond their power to describe. They reach such conclusions after paying a visit to Hester, Essex, Ludlow, Suffolk, Norfolk, and other streets, say on a Thursday afternoon or a Friday morning. But these ladies and gentlemen had never visited the homes of these apparently unclean people who sell and buy from a pushcart or stands and small stores in these streets, which are the only places for marketing the city fathers have thought it advisable to give them. If these reformers and philanthropists had taken the trouble to visit the homes of these people, they would surely have changed their opinion. In fact, of the homes of the poor population of the city, the Jewish home is the cleanest. And he continued, the impression that Russian Jews are uncleanly, I repeat again, is only gained by those who have not visited the homes of the industrious people which are in the majority and only observed the unsanitary conditions of the streets and the swarming humanity, men, women, and children. The cause of this is not far to seek. The ghetto in New York is the most densely populated spot on earth. The population is generally very poor and cannot afford to employ servants to take care of the children, and the Jewish family is commonly larger than that of Gentiles. Now, you might object and say that Fishberg was biased because he was an immigrant himself, having arrived in New York from Russia in 1889, and that would be fair enough. But Fishberg, it should be remembered, was not just any Russian Jewish immigrant. He later became professor of medicine at New York University and Bellevue Medical College. Regardless, Fishberg refused to blame the Jewish immigrants, for the unsanitary conditions in which they may find themselves. Instead, he called out the negligent city officials who permit in the Jewish streets nuisances which would not be tolerated in any other quarter of the city. Though at the same time, he noted that the streets of the New York Jewish quarter are cleaner than the streets inhabited by the poor Italians, Bohemians, and other immigrant populations. Fishberg claimed that observant Jews were required to wash their hands after using the latrine and before eating. Married women who were of childbearing age would attend the ritual bath called the mikveh about once a month, and all Orthodox Jews were careful about what food they could eat. Fishberg cited another observer of Jewish habits who argued that Judaism has made religion the handmaid of science. It has utilized piety for the preservation of health. Now, Fishberg's work is certainly idealized and hardly objective, but still there is some more epidemiological data that supported his claim that the Jews were healthier and cleaner than many other New Yorkers. In 1891, John Shaw Billings, a physician and officer in the United States Army in charge of vital statistics, used survey data that had been obtained by the Washington Jewish leader Adolphus Solomons. Now, Solomons, with the help of communal rabbis, had gathered a remarkable database of about 60,000 Jews across the United States, all of whom had been in the country for more than 5 years. Here is Billings' original data taken from the journal, and I have redrawn some of it for clarity. And Billings found that just like the Jews of Europe, his American sample had a death rate that was only about half that of the general population. Their life expectancy was 20% longer. There were fewer of the, quote, so-called defective classes, including the insane, idiotic, blind, deaf, mute, deformed, maimed, and crippled. And most notably for our purposes, it is very evident from the data collected that these Jews were much less affected with tubercular disease and especially tubercular consumption than the average population. In other words, wrote Billings, the proportion of deaths among Jews was less than 1/3 for males and less than 1/4 for females of what it was in the average population. This news, Billings' news, was not all good. Jews were more likely to suffer from diabetes, from malignancies, heart disease, and disorders of the digestive system. And for some reason, the death rate of Jewish lawyers from consumption was over 5 times greater than the average death rate. Because Jewish immigrants had been so closely identified with tuberculosis, however, Billings' findings are very important. In this country, as in other countries, he wrote, the Jews are less liable than others to tuberculosis. What might be the reason for this finding that the Jews were less likely to tuberculosis? Billings considered and ultimately rejected a suggestion that the improved measure of health was a result of the laws of kashrut. He also rejected the suggestion that Jews caught less tuberculosis because they were more separated from other people. Unable to provide a satisfactory explanation for this, for what was epidemiological certainty, Billings' final suggestion is one that today's science would not support. He wondered whether the leukocytes or blood serum of one particular race of men differ from those of others in their destructive effects upon the vitality of microorganisms of any particular species. But this, he says, has not yet been determined. And in fact, so far as I'm aware, the experiment has not yet been tried. But it would not at all be surprising if such a difference were found to exist in view of the differences which we know have been found to exist between different varieties of the same species of animal as regards immunity from the pathogenic effects of certain microorganisms. The Jews, Billings concluded, have certainly shown remarkable staying powers in the struggle for existence. And to the physician, the physiologist, and the sanitarian, this is not especially surprising. This is not especially surprising when their comparative temperance, their system of female hygiene, and their occupations are considered. But obviously, past results are no guarantee of future returns, and these things might be different in the long run. They have shown, he wrote, that they can resist adversity but whether they can also withstand the influences of wealth and freedom and retain the modes of life which have heretofore given them the strength, given them length of days, remains to be seen. So much for the tuberculous Jew. I'd now like to turn to two epidemics that occurred here in New York City in 1892. And we'll begin with typhus. And first, some background. Typhus, which comes from the Greek word typhos, meaning confusion, is caused by a bacterium called rickettsia, but it cannot spread without the body louse. Once inside the louse, rickettsia causes internal bleeding, and the louse takes on a reddish color as its blood leaks into its tissues. Eventually, the carrier louse dies, and if it is on the skin or the clothing or the bedding of a person, the bacterium passes through the skin of the louse and into human cells. There, the bacterium reproduces during the incubation of about 2 weeks. It then causes a rash, fever, headaches, confusion, hallucinations, and abdominal pain, and it may spread to the lungs where it causes pneumonia. Before the antibiotic era, about 60% of all cases of typhus were fatal. Like tuberculosis, typhus was also associated with the poor who had managed to emigrate and who faced new living conditions that were not always much better than those they had left behind. On February 13th, 1892, an editorial in the New York Times described how the SS Massilia had carried 248 Russian Hebrews, of whom about a third were found to be infected with typhus. Before 1891, here in New York City had averaged about 13 cases of typhus per year, but the number had climbed to over 550 cases and 160 deaths. There was now a typhus epidemic here in New York. The New York Times noted that it was sympathetic to the plight of the persecuted Hebrews in Russia. No one, it wrote, will accuse this journal of having failed to appreciate the hardships of these unfortunate persons or to express that sympathy which their story must excite in the breasts of all those who abhor oppression and pity the oppressed and the destitute. However, said the New York Times, there were still limits. It is the duty of the people of this country to protect themselves against the importation of such persons as these who the Massilia brought to this port. Especially, it is the duty of the people of New York to protest against the admission of those whose habits and condition invite deadly infectious diseases and who carry with them the seeds of a plague that can be stamped out only by the most energetic measures. Such immigrants, these Jewish immigrants, are not wanted either in this city or in any other part of the United States. They should be excluded. The doors should be shut against them. A week later, the New York Times published an anonymous letter that thanked it for its timely, able, and just editorial. It was time to do something for our own preservation and our own perpetuation. We do not want, and we ought to refuse to land all or any of these unclean Italians or Russian Hebrews. We have enough dirt, misery, crime, sickness, and death of our own. About 9 years earlier, the American Jewish poet Emma Lazarus had written the sonnet, The New Colossus, to raise money for the construction of the platform of the Statue of Liberty. In 1903, the poem was cast on a bronze plaque and hung on the pedestal where it still can be seen to this day. Keep ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. But in truth, New York did not want the wretched refuse of another teeming shore. unless they were healthy. Even the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, which later became the prestigious New England Journal of Medicine, added its voice to those who opposed the immigration process. It was a folly which we as a nation are permitting to be committed in the beautiful name of freedom. We open our doors to squalor and filth and misery, which means typhus fever, and we admit leprosy, almost as if these things were a blessing in disguise. There are times when charity should begin at home. Now, the Lower East Side of New York was impossibly overcrowded. An average apartment, 25 foot by 25 foot, might house 4 people to a room, and dozens of people shared one rudimentary bathroom. No matter how hard the Yiddish mama struggled to keep her home decent and clean for her family, the physician historian Howard Markle observed in his history of the typhus outbreak, it was always an uphill battle. Add to this the odor of rotting meat, fish and vegetables sold on uncovered push carts, the immense amount of animal waste from the horse-drawn wagons and trucks, dirty streets, and the stench of a crowded humanity where over 82,000 people lived, worked, and played within 50 square blocks. Dirt was all-pervading in the Lower East Side, as were its frequent companions: crime, prostitution, and vice. The city's chief sanitary inspector, Cyrus Edson, led a careful and violent effort to track down every passenger who had disembarked from the Massilia that February. Armed health inspectors, accompanied by Yiddish-speaking officials from Jewish charities, searched every boarding house in the district. Edson's search was certainly not equitable. Italian passengers from the Massilia were only briefly detained, while the Jewish ones were, as Edson himself put it, rigidly quarantined. In fact, 1,200 people were quarantined. Most were sent to the Riverside Isolation Hospital on North Brother Island, where a month or so later, those who recovered from typhus or who never developed it were released. Edson's tactics quickly contained the threat, and New York's typhus epidemic was over by April of 1892. There were 138 cases of typhus among the passengers of the Massilia, of whom 13 died. Along with them, 6 residents of the city, 4 nurses and a police officer also died. Markel also noted that there were other costs in the form of violated civil liberties, cultural insensitivities, inadequate financial or physical resources devoted to their medical care, and the macabre fate of quarantine and possible death. While Jewish immigrants were certainly infected with typhus, the truth of the matter was that they were unlikely to have been its source. The incubation period for typhus is only about 2 weeks, and yet the immigrants had left Russia some 4 months earlier. They had been forced to spend 3 months in Constantinople before being expelled, traveling to Marseille, and then embarking on their 28-day Atlantic crossing. They had therefore most likely been infected with typhus while in Turkey. Although other foreign ports like those in Germany and Italy had higher numbers of typhus victims, it was only immigrants from Russia who were subject to later quarantine policies. Getzel Zelikovich, a Russian rabbinical student turned Yiddish journalist, wrote that the brief and relatively contained typhus epidemic was overshadowed by another far more serious one: the typhus of the soul that is called anti-Semitism. I'll return to this chilling phrase later. Now, no sooner had one epidemic, the typhus epidemic, been contained than another rose to threaten public health. There had been outbreaks of cholera in America in 1832, in 1849, in 1866, but these had eventually run their course and had abruptly vanished. However, in the 1890s, a new cholera pandemic, rampant in much of Europe, Great Britain, and Russia, had the American immigration authorities very worried. In Russia, about 620,000 people became ill with the disease, and almost half of them, 300,000 Russians, had died. Once again, the New York Times took the lead in suggesting that it was the Jews who would bring cholera back to America. With the danger from cholera, it is plain that the United States would be better off if ignorant Russian Jews and Hungarians were denied a refuge here. Every big American city has its colony of Russian Jews or Poles or Hungarians, and every good citizen knows that they make the most undesirable residents. These people are offensive enough at best. Under the present circumstances, they are a positive menace to the health of the country. Even should they pass the quarantine officials, their mode of life when they settle down makes them always a source of danger. Cholera, it must be remembered, originates in the homes of this human riffraff. Cholera originates in the homes of this human riffraff. It was a remarkably racist comment, even in an era when the word racist had yet to be coined. And it was also entirely medically incorrect. For although one theory had long associated cholera with excessive drinking, an intemperate lifestyle, and poverty, it had been known for almost 3 decades that, in fact, cholera did not originate in the homes of human riffraff. It came from a contaminated water supply. Here, for example, is Osler's Principles and Practice of Medicine, the foremost text of its time, written by Sir William Osler, professor of medicine at the Johns Hopkins University. In the first edition, published in that year, 1892, the book is now in some 30 or 40 editions. In the first edition, published in 1892, Osler had written that the leading authorities now agree that the disease, cholera, is propagated chiefly by the contamination of water used for drinking, washing, and cooking. Not only in India has the demonstration of the connection between drinking water and cholera infection been amply furnished, but in England there have been many valuable illustrations. The New York Times correspondents had, alas, not consulted Osler's work. Passenger ships that embarked from Hamburg to the United States were filling their holds with drinking water from the River Elbe, and that water was contaminated with Vibrio cholera, the bacteria responsible for the transmission of cholera. The first ship from Hamburg to arrive with cholera on board was the SS Moravia. It docked in New York on August 30th, 1892, by which time 29 passengers had died from the disease. 20 of them were Russian children. One Yiddish reporter wrote that their bodies had all been thrown overboard while at sea, as if they were dead birds or garbage. A few days later, the Rugia arrived. It carried over 500 passengers, of whom 5 had died and another 4 were seriously ill. Then came the Normannia with 300 crew members, 482 immigrants below decks and steerage, and another 573 first and second class passengers, including a US senator and Lottie Collins, a British music hall star about to embark on her American career. 7 passengers died. The ship was quarantined for 2 weeks, during which time another 53 passengers died from cholera. Although the microbe responsible for cholera had been identified, and it was known that the disease was primarily transmitted through the fecal-oral route, patients from these and other ships that docked in New York were not managed by scientific principles, but instead were led by what Markel called politics and nativistic sentiment. Sometimes first-class passengers avoided quarantine altogether, but even when they were required to quarantine along with everyone else, the conditions for the wealthier travelers were quite different. Steerage class passengers, for example, from the Normannia, who were all poor immigrants, were directed to the overcrowded conditions on Hoffman Island, while cabin class passengers were found more suitable accommodations. Abraham Kahan, a Yiddish journalist, observed that when rich people scream, there is, of course, an immediate response. For the rich first-class passengers, they bought a fine hotel, and for the paupers, they put military tents on a field in which they set up beds. Despite the quarantine, or maybe because of it, cholera and measles soon broke through to the mainland, and in New York, there were 9 deaths from cholera. In addition, 44 immigrants, mostly Eastern European Jews, died while in quarantine. Cyrus Edson, who had spearheaded the fight against the recent typhus epidemic, organized a series of immigrant raids and detentions, and over 39,000 tenement homes on the Lower East Side were inspected. Edson had declared them to be breeding places of the allies of cholera, as well as cholera itself. Ever zealous, Edson also shut down Jewish butchers for any number of minor infractions of the sanitary code. Homes in which there was a suspected case of cholera were emptied, disinfected, and shuttered. Despite all this, the immigrants had little to do with the outbreak of cholera in New York. All but one of the victims had lived in the US for at least a year, and none seemed to have had any contact with newly arrived immigrants. There was no evidence that cholera had arrived by way of these new immigrants, and it is just as likely that it was introduced by health officials or newspaper reporters who had traveled between ships and shore and who may not have paid sufficient attention to careful hand washing. By the end of September 1892, the brief New York cholera epidemic came to a sudden end. Ships were again able to enter the port, and now that the city of Hamburg had admitted that its water sources were contaminated, more care was paid to the origin of the supplies taken on board by disembarking passenger ships. So this is the history of the epidemics of tuberculosis, typhus, and cholera that broke out here in New York City at the turn of the 19th century. And I had thought to end my talk here. But one phrase from this story struck in my mind. It was from that Yiddish journalist, Getzel Zelikovich, who discussed what he considered to be a far more serious epidemic than typhus, the typhus of the soul that is called anti-Semitism. And here we are 130 years later, after Zelikovich wrote of this fear, and the United States is in the midst of a tidal wave of anti-Semitic attacks. As you can see from the data here, these attacks were on the rise before the Hamas slaughter of 1,200 men, women, and children. Since those attacks, there has been more than a 3-fold increase in anti-Semitic incidents here in the United States. Here, for example, is a swastika drawn on a board belonging to the research group of a Jewish faculty member. The faculty member's name is listed on the door and is identifiably Jewish. It happened on April 20th, 2023 at MIT. Oh, and by the way, the MIT police were contacted and a complaint was filed with them. But a year later, the Jewish faculty member has not yet received an update nor indication of follow-up actions. Here's a march that took place near Columbia University in New York on November 15th. By any means necessary here, of course, refers to the murder of Jewish babies and the raping of Jewish women. And most recently, there's a kosher restaurant on the Upper West Side, a few blocks from here on 96th and Columbus. It is called Effie's Cap. Just a few days ago on Saturday, it was attacked. And this is what it looked like yesterday, before volunteers spent hours cleaning the windows and the sidewalk. And here is the front cover of this month's Atlantic, a periodical known for its left-of-center views. Anti-Semitism on the right and the left, the article says, threatens to bring to a close an unprecedented period of safety and prosperity for Jewish Americans and demolish the liberal order they helped to establish. I could go on, but you know this as well as I do. The typhus of the soul, which is called anti-Semitism, is still spreading without relief. I could have stopped here and ended, but I want to tell you the story of another way that Jewish immigrants have been treated. In 1948, the State of Israel was established. How then did Israel face the threat of epidemic diseases from the many hundreds of thousands of Jewish immigrants to her shores? Were Jewish immigrants to Israel treated differently in their homeland than in London or in New York? Between the founding of the state in 1948 and 1951, the fledgling country absorbed 700,000 people. Most came from Europe, and the remainder came from North Africa, Iran, Iraq, and Yemen. Within 3 years, the population of the country doubled. Now, under the British mandate, there were immigration quotas, though these did not stipulate which kind of immigrants, whether it would be professionals or laborers or dependents. It didn't stipulate which kind would be granted a visa. But the Palestine Zionist executive, which advised the mandate authorities, instituted a medical certification process. Because there was an overall immigration quota, the executive gave preferential treatment to young, healthy applicants. After the Second World War and the horrors of the Holocaust, these visa requirements were set aside, and the country opened her borders to any and every Jew. But it soon became clear that many of the immigrants were not only malnourished, but they also had serious medical conditions, and some 10% were sick enough to require immediate hospitalization. The new government of Israel was faced with an impossibly difficult decision. It could allow immigration to continue unfettered, but this would overwhelm the rudimentary medical system, which was already dealing with many casualties from what we call the War of Independence, and could introduce infectious diseases into the established population. Or it could require a medical screening for every immigrant, which could delay their entry and which would be particularly damaging for the many concentration camp survivors. Chaim Moshe Shapira, who served as the Minister of Health in the provisional government of David Ben-Gurion, was a vocal supporter of the screening option. He wrote, "Within immigration, there is too high a percentage of elderly and weak who are neither fit for war nor for work. In place of a frail Jew, it is possible to bring in a Jew who is able either to work for the economy or wield a weapon. They are taking onto the ships mentally ill and those sick with tuberculosis and all kinds of diseases that are a disaster for the Jewish community and the country." The provisional government failed to reach consensus, but had to revisit the matter soon after independence was declared. By then, there was an absolute health crisis. Tuberculosis was widespread in children, but they required special isolation, and there was not a single bed available for them in a hospital. Dr. Yosef Meir, who headed the General Health Fund, the Kupat Cholim, wrote an urgent letter to Shapira, who was now Israel's first Minister of Health. According to the evaluation of physicians dealing with tuberculosis, wrote Yosef Meir, presently there are about 1,000 persons with active tuberculosis in the community. One can easily imagine what damage these sick people could bring under the crowded and hygienic sanitary conditions prevailing in the transit camps. One can deduce with equal certainty that among the 200,000 new immigrants that have come here in the past year, there are some 1,700 stricken with active tuberculosis in the Jewish community. Without forgetting, this number does not include local patients with tuberculosis. Ben-Gurion himself recognized the challenge of an open door policy. He wrote, "Among the immigrants, there are many sick with tuberculosis and venereal diseases." This is him writing in his diary in 1949. And this should be forestalled. In January, 1,500 patients with trachoma arrived. These can be cured. Severe disease should not be forestalled. Ben-Gurion brought the matter to the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, where Shapira, his health minister, painted a bleak but honest picture. Hospitalization of those with tuberculosis and the mentally ill have worsened to a very dangerous degree. In regard to medical services, all our budgetary calculations have proven false, in that the torrent of immigration decimates all calculations. The health service attempts to prevent the immigration of sick persons, and there are preliminary medical examinations, and there is supervision. But among the immigrants rushing to immigrate to the country, there are no small numbers that have learned to overcome all the checkpoints, and they are arriving by all sorts of avenues. Meanwhile, Yosef Meir, now the Director General of the Ministry of Health, published an open letter to the Israeli newspaper Davar, in which he suggested that immigrants should be treated in their home countries before boarding a plane or a boat to travel to Israel. If that doesn't happen, he said, then before sending them to us, hospital beds must be prepared for them. If we haven't done that, we are committing a sin against the immigrants and against ourselves. Chaim Shiba, who succeeded Meir as Director General of the Ministry of Health in 1950 and who has a hospital named after him in Israel, Chaim Shiba also supported a limited immigration policy. Shiba, who trained as a physician in Vienna, was in fact a strong supporter of eugenics. But there is no evidence that Shiba made his recommendations based upon the cultural background of the immigrants rather than the prevalence of disease. However, the result was that a large number of Jewish immigrants were prevented from leaving their countries of origin. In 1951, Shiba canceled entry permits for all the Jews of Cochin in India because they were infected with filariasis, a parasitic disease caused by microscopic worms. Shiba feared they would introduce the disease into Israel, and they were only finally approved to enter Israel in February of 1954. In 1950, a compromise position was adopted. Immigration would continue without restrictions, but all immigrants would undergo a medical screening exam before immigrating. And this position was also adopted when the Knesset passed the law of return in July 1950, as well as requiring an immigrant to prove their Jewish ancestry rather than simply declaring it. The law allowed the Ministry of the Interior to prevent immigration if the applicant was liable to endanger the public health or the security of the state. In actuality, this clause was only rarely applied, and only a few dozen applicants were rejected on medical grounds alone. When the Jews of Yemen were airlifted into Israel in September of 1950, most were in poor health, and many were suffering from malaria, ringworm, and tuberculosis. Their health, however, was never questioned, and neither was the ability of the state to cover their medical costs. Harry Vitalis, who represented the Jewish Distribution Committee in Israel, observed that the human cargo on our planes is a pitiful sight. The people are suffering from malnutrition. 5-year-old children weigh as little as 20 pounds. The skeletons of Bergen-Belsen have reappeared in Aden. Yet they underwent no prior medical screening exams, and within a few months, 50,000 Yemenite Jews had been airlifted to Israel. With later waves of immigration, the refugees faced the same problems. Starting in the 1980s, Israel secretly airlifted some 40,000 Ethiopian Jews through Sudan. When news of Operation Moses was announced by Prime Minister Shimon Peres in January 1985, Sudan ended its cooperation with Israel, leaving several thousand Jews in Ethiopia. But over the next 30 years, Israel continued to bring them into her borders. Many of these refugees had medical problems, including malaria, typhoid fever, and intestinal infections. Rates of tuberculosis varied from 10 to 40% of the refugees. To put this into context, these rates were between 200 and 500 times greater than the rate of tuberculosis among Israelis during that period. In May 1991, Israel airlifted over 14,000 Jews from Ethiopia to Israel in 36 hours in what was called Operation Solomon. It set a record for the greatest number of passengers on a commercial flight. around 1,088, although the exact precise number is not known. 5 babies were born on the planes that were used. Still, there were worries about infectious diseases. Aboard flight number 9 this morning, wrote New York Times reporter Joel Brinkley, on a Boeing 757 with the El Al insignia and Star of David painted over, workers here had covered all the seats and flooring with thick plastic sheeting to protect them in case any immigrants carried infectious diseases. 5 doctors or paramedics were aboard, and said they worried that some of the Ethiopians might carry cholera, malaria, or possibly even AIDS. The story of the Jewish immigrant as a carrier of disease took a new turn while the world was still very much in the grip of the COVID pandemic. The B'nai Menashe, the descendants of Menashe, for example, are a community in northeast India and Myanmar that practices a form of Judaism. In May 2021, Israel received 160 members of the B'nai Menashe who arrived on a specially chartered plane despite a ban on flights from India because of COVID. They were welcomed by Israel's Minister for Immigration and Absorption, Peninnah Tamanu-Shata, who herself was born in Ethiopia. As they stepped off the plane, many of the B'nai Menashe immigrants knelt down on the ground, removed their COVID masks, and kissed the ground. They underwent a brief intake interview and were then sent into quarantine because of the COVID pandemic. Minister Tamanu-Shata was clearly moved by what she had seen. I am overjoyed, she said, to welcome the dear men and women from the community of Menashe, and we will do everything in our power to ensure that their immigration will be easy. And we endeavor to speed the process for those remaining in India. There were still challenges for those left in India. In June 2021, the immigration of about 40 members of the community was delayed when they tested positive for the COVID virus and were forced to quarantine in a Sikh temple in New Delhi. Like many of their predecessors who had arrived in Israel over the previous 50 years, the B'nai Menashe had to quarantine because of a fear that they might be carriers of a disease. But this time, it was understood that they were not being singled out because of their Jewish status. Indeed, the country into which they were arriving had itself grappled with the very same disease, COVID. Over the last 2 centuries, Jewish immigrants and refugees were implicated as the carriers of pandemic diseases like typhus, tuberculosis, cholera, and HIV. On many occasions, these fears were factually correct. They did indeed carry typhus and tuberculosis and cholera and HIV, but not because they were Jews. They carried them because they were impoverished, without access to clean water and healthy living conditions. Living under these conditions, anyone would become a carrier. At last, the reception of the B'nai Menashe did not mirror some anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic trope. Instead, it was in fact a reflection of the best public health practices that were in place for all residents of the country, old and new alike. The Jewish immigrant had finally arrived. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful and incredibly timely when we think about the immigration situation in New York City today. I'll ask the first question. You guys have questions as well?
No, I thought go ahead,
Okay.
Joe.
My first question is it was curious because the New York Times was a Jewish periodical. And, they mentioned specifically Hungarian, Romanian, Polish Jews, not German Jews. And there was a hierarchy amongst Jews in the city who the German Jews had arrived in the 1820s and 30s, and they were higher class. And was that part of it? Was that kind of a sort of an anti-Semitism within the community?
I did not specifically look at that, but you are, of course, correct. Older refugees are always seen, they assume a higher status, and the newer refugees are often looked down by the older refugees. Indeed, the Jews of Berlin in the 1800s used to call the Jews from Russia who were immigrating or trying to immigrate into Berlin, they used to call them Ostjuden, meaning Jews of the East. So yes, there is a hierarchy amongst different refugees. There are the sentences that I shared with you are so difficult to say. The words are so difficult to repeat. As I said, even at a time when the word racist had not been properly, had not been coined, it was only really started to become a word in the 1960s. I think the New York Times was very anti-Semitic. That's all you can say. And there were other races implicated as well. The experience that I've shared today was possibly duplicated by other refugee populations, including Italians. I haven't studied that story in detail, so I'm not familiar with it. But I suspect that we will find, as so often the case, that the Jews had it worse. And certainly the quotes that I've shared with you from the New York Times and from the New England Journal of Medicine and so on certainly support the idea that those who could write were certainly not in support of their immigration.
Any questions from the live audience? Ezra?
Before I ask my own question, I'm wondering if Tehila is on Zoom, because I wanted to her to speak a little bit about her research. Tehila, are you on? Thank you very much. This was a fascinating and very, very important talk. I basically what I had wanted to ask is, how do you view some of the more recent issues, both obviously the COVID pandemic was a huge occurrence in terms of how public health and anti-Semitism became intertwined with each other. But to what degree do you think that we as members of the Jewish community can do in order to improve their interactions with the public health authorities? More specifically, I'm thinking of things that occurred as a precursor to the COVID pandemic, such as the measles outbreak here in the greater New York area, issues with reticence about sort of routine and standard immunizations, and also some of the public health response that we saw within the Haredi community here in New York.
Okay, that's a big question.
Yes.
First of all, it is always the outsider who is blamed for public health crises. President Trump made a point of referring to COVID as the China virus, which wasn't altogether incorrect, as far as we know. And we have Ebola, which we're all comfortable in calling the Ebola virus because it's named after a river in Africa, or West Nile virus. So we do often refer to diseases as their place of origin, and it's always been a natural part of the human nature to blame outsiders. In fact, in his book, The Plague Years, by Daniel Defoe, yeah, The Plague Years opens, and now The Plague Years is a fictional account of plague in London in 1600, but it's based on written records. And he opens it by saying everybody was blaming the French for the outbreak of plague in London. There's a traditional enmity between the British and the French, and certainly goes back a long way. So first of all, it is clear that outsiders are always blamed for disease and for epidemics. In terms of the specific response of the Jewish community and what can be done to improve it, I would say the following. Number one, it's 2 chapters in my book. I have an entire chapter on on anti-vaxxers, Jewish anti-vaxxers. And they've been around for almost as long as there's been a vaccine, but so have secular anti-vaccine. There are at least 3 anti-vaccine movements in the United States from the 1880s, 1870s onwards. But when I studied the phenomena, and I write about this in my book, it became very clear to me that there is no such thing as a Jewish anti-vaxxer. As a Jewish anti-vaxxer. There is such thing as an anti-vaxxer who happens to be Jewish. In the same way that there's an anti-vaxxer who happens to be an atheist, or an anti-vaxxer who happens to be a fundamentalist Christian or Muslim, or what you have. The anti-vax part of these people's identity does not spring from their Judaism. You find sources and cherry-pick sources to support it. But at their core, they are just anti-vaxxers who happen to be Jews. And they're no different from anti-vaxxers of other backgrounds, and there's plenty of data which I reference in the book to the fact that the anti-vaxxers who are Jews get their information from the same sources as anti-vaxxers who are not Jews. We know that anti-vaxxers as a movement have nothing to do necessarily with levels of education. It's not enough to be able to say the people are not educated. It's something beyond that. And let's also remember there is a huge anti-vaccination wave that has swept through Europe in the last 15 years. This certainly predates COVID. So I would say that as a community, we don't have anything to be embarrassed about. The Jewish community did overall very well. There were pockets of people who broke the law, and it's wrong that they did that. Like there were pockets of people everywhere who broke the law. Nations contain extremists of all sorts, and the Jews are no different. But I would say that to think of Jewish anti-vaxxers as a mistake. We have to think of anti-vaxxers as a movement, and in that movement there are pockets of all kinds of people: atheists, fundamentalist Christians, Muslims, Hindus, and certainly Jews.
If I may just
follow
up on that. You hear me?
Yeah.
So, there's an idea or a principle in Judaism called Chilul Hashem. And basically for a general audience, I would basically say, we kind of have to keep a good image and a good reputation because anti-Semitism is so prevalent and pervasive and deep. So I guess I agree 100% with every single word you said. And I guess the question I'm asking myself, and I'm interested in knowing your opinion about, is do you not agree that maybe we are treated unjustly for sure, but perhaps there's a way in which we can maybe slightly overcompensate and improve our image?
Yes, there is no doubt that when breaches of COVID policy were reported in the media, it does lead to a feeling of embarrassment on the part of those who share a religion or a community. I would hope that there is an embarrassment, but I don't think it in any way characterizes the Jewish response. However, fundamentalist Jews, just like fundamentalist Christians, just like the fundamentalist church that was closed down early in COVID in Florida because it refused to stop meeting and was a hotbed of COVID infection, just like Hindu temples that refused to stop meeting, and there were also hotbeds of COVID. Fundamentalist Jews take on the same characteristics in their response to illness as do other populations. And I think it's important to realize that fundamentalist communities of whatever sort are harder to reach. They don't use the internet generally. They don't rely on medical opinion. Generally, this is a characterization of all fundamentalist sects. They don't believe governments. And so it makes it very hard to somehow get to them when there are these important public health issues. And I'm sure people will do a great deal of research into what actually happened during COVID and where the response might have reached people that it couldn't.
So we're sort of over. So I want to give anybody else in the room an opportunity to ask a question online.
Nicole did put in the chat that it is named after the elder.
Oh, it's
Elder.
named after the elder, Heberden. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you, Nicole, from Norway. Very
Norway.
good.
Still the wisest person online. Okay, well, I think we're going to end it here with just tremendous gratitude for your brilliant and learned talk. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.